Hello, and welcome to the fourth edition of Let's Talk Competition. My name is Javier Espinoza. I'm the FT's EU Correspondent covering competition and digital policy from Brussels. And today I will be moderating our discussion. We are here to talk about the EU's brand new and landmark piece of legislation, the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, or FSR. These are new rules that will address a major gap in the single market by introducing control over subsidies granted by non-EU countries to companies that are operating within the bloc. State aid control has long been part of EU policy. It makes sure that the Commission authorizes subsidies from member states. But so far, there was not such control over foreign subsidies. That's until now. This absence has raised concerns about fairness in the single market. The FSR is aimed at ensuring a level playing field. It tackles the issues of unfair competition created by foreign subsidies, which can crowd out companies that do not receive such support. The FSR seeks to restore balance, ensure business decisions are driven by efficiencies and opportunities rather than just financial aid. Stay tuned as we explore its implications, its challenges and opportunities for implementation, and the roles that different stakeholders will have in its enforcement. With me for today's discussion, it gives me a pleasure to have Eddy de Smijter, Head of Unit of International Relations in charge of the FSR at the Director General for Competition at the European Commission, Merit Olthoff, Partner for Antitrust, Competition and Trade at Freshfields, and Yves-Emmanuel Bara, Deputy Head of the Economic Trade and Financial Services at the French Perm Representation for the European Union. As regards to the format of today's discussion, it will be divided in three main blocks: the diagnosis and reasons for this new piece of legislation, the FSR, the challenges of implementing it, and its practical application and the role of private and national actors. I'll be putting your questions to the panel, so please do start submitting them as of now using Slido. You can access Slido in two forms. One, by scanning the QR code that you can find on the DG competition website, and that will be popping up on your screen regularly, as you can see now. And you can also enter it in slido.com and use the hashtag Let's Talk Competition to participate. Also, I really encourage that you share your views on social media using the same hashtag Let's Talk Competition. So let's talk competition and start with Yves-Emmanuel. And the first question to you, what is the FSR and why do we need this new piece of legislation?
Yeah, I think you put it very well, Javier. There has been a missing block in the single market for years. Basically, we have been with state aid control since the Treaty of Rome. So subsidies that are given by member states of the EU have been controlled by the Commission since the onset of the European Union. But this is not the case for foreign subsidies. Now, is it a problem? Well, of course, part of the issue can be tackled through the World Trade Organization rules, especially when you are talking about exports and subsidies given to exports. There are rules at the international level that aim to deal with that, and also at European level, we have taken a number of instruments in order to be able to tackle issues linked with subsidies dealing with exports. But foreign subsidies that are aimed at activities that are located in the single market, for the moment, were not tackled by any instrument whatsoever. So this is basically the aim of the FSR, to deal with this missing block and to do it and to try to do it in a very proportionate, very non-discriminatory way, basically taking inspiration from what we've been doing with state aid control, dealing with now 27 member states subsidies, to expand to some extent this control to further countries.
Excellent, thank you. And Eddy, before we get into the question about the targeting of the problem, tell me about the reason of this regulation, since you're at the heart of it. You've been drafting this for years.
Well, we have done that together with the co-legislator, obviously, and in consultation also with the stakeholders. mean, the very purpose is indeed, as Yves-Emmanuel was mentioning it, it's an issue of level playing field. And we are an open market. We should remain an open market, open for investment. But if there are investments in the EU, then that needs to be on a fair ground. I mean, we like competition in the internal market, but the competition needs to be on basis of the merit, not, as you mentioned, you take your decisions on the basis of commercial incentives, or maybe you are the most innovative one. But we should not allow that companies that are receiving aid from a third country and thereby getting an advantage. They get an advantage because that same aid, if it would have been given by a member state, would not have been accepted. If you are in that situation of an unjustified advantage being given by a foreign subsidy, then you are not having any competition on the merits in the internal market, and therefore not a level playing field. And that is exactly what the FSR is about, restoring the level playing field.
I mean, this might be a bit of a leading question, but the President of the European Commission has already announced cases on subsidies targeted at China. Is this being targeted at a particular country?
Those are two questions. So first of all, on the second one, no. This is not targeted at one specific country. It is addressing all non-EU subsidies, as you have said. More than that, it is not targeting foreign-owned companies. It is targeted at every company active on the internal market, whether they are foreign or EU-owned, that is receiving foreign subsidies. And the reason for that is what Yves-Emmanuel just mentioned. It's the non-discrimination. Besides that, which is a good legal argument, strong enough in itself, besides that, if we would only be targeting foreign-owned companies active on the internal market, it will be too easy to circumvent the rules. And so there are good reasons on policy and legally to target all aid from a non-EU country to any company active on the internal market. On your other question on what President von der Leyen referred to in her State of the Union, that's a good moment to clarify a bit what the different instruments are. I think Yves-Emmanuel already referred to the WTO rules, which are applicable to the import of subsidized goods. When you are facing that situation, then we can go after that with our traditional trade defense instruments. And that is what DG Trade has been doing already for a time, and they continue doing. What President von der Leyen referred to in her State of the Union was indeed, and I assume that it's the e-vehicles, that is an investigation by DG Trade. To complement the trade defense instrument, because there was that gap, since we could only look into the import of subsidized goods, we have the FSR, and the foreign subsidy regulation has been, from the very start and also during the negotiations, and it will continue in the enforcement, has been a job that we have done together in DG Comp with the colleagues from DG Grow, because it has this public procurement element to it, which is a very specific set of rules. And so the colleagues from DG Grow will use their expertise to look into the public procurement related issues, distortions caused by foreign subsidies. And in DG Comp, we will focus obviously on concentrations, where we have the practice in doing that, but also in ex officio cases that are not public procurement related.
That's a very clear sort of distinction and explanation to clarify. So thank you for that. And Merit, from your perspective, you deal with lots of the companies that might be affected by this new regulation. Can we talk about it within the framework of also this China case, as we're discussing now?
Yes, happy to. And I think picking up on these China cases that Eddy mentioned, indeed, if you observed the media when these cases were announced by President von der Leyen, in particular into e-vehicles, a lot of people got confused and thought that these are actually investigations which the Commission has opened under the FSR, which is not the case. As Eddy said, These are cases which are investigated in the WTO rules, EU's anti-subsidy rules, and are probably the most high-profile cases we've seen since the Commission investigated solar panels. But if you look at the heart of both of these e-vehicles and also solar panels, we are looking at fundamentally subsidization coming from outside the EU, from a third country. So why should these not be then also part of an FSR investigation in scope? It's very clear the FSR itself stipulates, and legislators have formulated the FSR in a way that the WTO rules prevail over the FSR rules. So the Commission cannot act upon these cases, which in my view is a shame, because we know that the WTO probes and investigations, they take a lot of time. And they also, and I think that's important to see, have a fundamental different outcome of the case. Under the WTO regime, it's a state-to-state, and you can impose countervailing measures. Under the FSR, the Commission has real enforcement powers. It can impose structural or behavioral remedies, or even in a worst case, order the repayment of the undue foreign subsidy. So they are different in what they have at the outcome of the investigation, but in scope, there are many similarities.
And so the companies that you talk to, are they concerned about the sort of new sort of regulatory burden that they're trying to face?
I think they are concerned. They are, let me put it that way, they are aware. And this is an EU regulation. It comes with a lot of obligation. It comes with fines if you don't comply. So I think that this is definitely something which is top of the agenda of many CEOs and board levels, because it is similar to the EU merger regulation. If you don't comply, you get a gun jumping fine. So what it does in practice is it adds a third layer of regulatory complexity for deals if you want to get them done from a regulatory perspective in the EU, while we traditionally had EU merger control. We've seen a lot of FDI come up at the national member state level. We now have the third layer of the foreign subsidies regulation, notification requirements under the transaction module. And we see clients struggle with assessing at this point in time, how long is it going to take me? What type of information do I need? And what impact does it have on my deal timeline? Because if something poses to be an issue under the EU merger regulation from a substantive point of view, it's not necessarily an issue under the FSR. So we will, as you think, see also diverging outcomes. And that's what businesses are concerned with, because they want to get their deals done in the EU.
And I want to talk to you about deal making and how it might affect things at greater depth. But before we do that, Yves-Emmanuel, can we talk about China in terms of when you're drafting, when you're the co-legislator writing a piece of legislation? Surely legislation is not written in the abstract. It comes from a problem that we're trying to address. How big of a concern was China in the discussions that you were having with your co-legislators, with your colleagues?
I must say that, indeed, we had the opportunity of making this file advance during the French presidency of the Council. We negotiated the position of the Council and as well as the political agreement with the Parliament. So we did that very well. In general, I must say we did not have anybody in mind when we were designing this regulation, because basically, or what we had in mind is rather the companies that are going to be targeted by the instrument. Because as Merit said, indeed, we need to be proportionate in what we do in general at the European Union. And we are not too fond of additional administrative burden to be put on companies, especially in this delicate phase of the economy. So this is why we adopted, and I think we were very careful in that, especially in the Council, a very proportionate approach with this regulation. So this regulation is going to apply in terms of its notification obligations only to very, very large undertakings, most likely, because the thresholds either for merger notification or public procurement notifications are extremely high. So it's really about a few hundreds of companies that should be targeted by this instrument, sorry. And maybe let me add a more high-level element to what I just said, which is, and maybe this is a reassuring message for viewers also, that clearly the EU remains open to business. This new instrument is absolutely not about closing the EU in any way or shape. This is about ensuring the level playing field. And this is good for companies, this is good for business in any case. And really, in order to have that, we need to have a rule-based system, and this has been the European way since the start of the European communities. We are only fostering and building on this heritage with this instrument that basically, as I said before, closes the gap in terms of how we can control that everything that goes on the single market is proper.
Going back to the deal-making point and in relation exactly to what Yves-Emmanuel is saying, companies on the record say that they love to be regulated and that it's great, and please do regulate us. Off the record, when I speak to them, that's a completely different story, I can tell you. And you talk to these companies, Meredith, and I want to know whether this will sort of harm their ability to do deals. Yes.
I don't know whether I subscribe to your on the record, off the record, but let's park that. So I think, yeah, I mean, as I said, it adds another regulatory layer of complexity for EU deals. I think, in essence, people will need to get to grips with what type of information is required and how they get their filings done. It will add to the information gathering process, and that is what companies need to do to comply with the form. But coming back to the earlier point of deal making, like there's a lot of uncertainty about how long will the Commission take to do pre-notification procedures, what information will be required during a typical pre-notification process, when do I get the green light to get on the clock. So you hear a lot of similar questions that sort of were posed many years ago when the EU merger regulation came into force. Mm-hmm. And we are just talking to businesses and companies to ensure that we have an open dialogue with the Commission and remain comfortable that we can reach outcomes on timing, but also on information with the Commission for these cases that are unproblematic to get on the clock quickly, and for those which are more problematic to take a bit more time.
On the more problematic ones, is it likely that this new tool will kill deals, do you think?
Kill or killing is a very strong word. So I think it will not kill competition. It will raise awareness and sensitivities for certain countries and investors from certain backgrounds. Because let's be honest again, we've heard Eddy say it's agnostic against, countries, businesses, incorporation and seats of incorporation. But surely there will be a couple of deals coming up where the Commission will want to have a second look, just because of the ownership structure of the company, the subsidies that may have been received, which are then still not leading to a distortion immediately, but which pose the fundamental question of, I think, this regulation, which is something being done on market terms here in the EU and in the internal market, or are we looking something which is fundamentally not on market terms?
And I know that it's early days, but have you detected any pushback from companies? Not wanting to comply or
no,
being
I think
worried.
Pushback not, because coming back to my earlier point of this is an EU regulation, you have quite drastic fines if you do not comply. So people and businesses are adamant to do comply. I think the problem lies elsewhere. The problem lies, what do I need to do to comply? And at the moment, that means I need to gather a lot of information. Because if I want to comply, I need to get my books and house in order to gather all the information on financial contributions. Financial contributions is a big term. Many people have referred to it. It is drafted in a term that sits in the regulation, so can unfortunately not be changed. It's very broad. It covers a lot of things like tax breaks, even arm's length dealings, and just funds that companies do receive in the ordinary course of business. The question is that all of this is not tracked by companies like revenue or asset information that can easily be pulled from the books. Most of this is a manual exercise at the moment that businesses have to look for where do I actually find the financial contributions that I need to report under the regulation or that I need to assess in order to assess for myself whether I'm in scope at all of the regulation. And that's what causes a lot of headache for businesses to find that information, digest it, and prepare it in a way that actually meets the Commission standard for disclosure in the notification.
And it's interesting that you mentioned headache, because I detect headache coming your way.
Really?
Because of this idea of this discussion as to whether who is or not in scope, which is a debate not just for this file, but you can translate that into all the other files of the European Commission. And Eddy, can you tell us a little bit about the process of appeal if a company feels that it's being unfairly targeted?
Well, let's first look at the assumption. I mean, the unfair treatment, that's not what we are going for. And I think that's already one of the base rules in how we will deal with cases. And that's the non-discrimination I mentioned previously. The non-discrimination goes in both directions. We say the level playing field. That means that you cannot be better off because you have received a foreign subsidy compared to a company that is receiving state aid from the member states. That's traditionally how we depict the level playing field. But it also works the other way around. You can also not be worse off if you have received foreign subsidies compared to state aid. So if a certain state aid would be compatible with the EU treaty and can therefore be granted, if that same subsidy would come from a non-EU state, we cannot suddenly find that to be distortive, because that would be discriminatory. So this non-discrimination is one of the key principles in the legislation, but also in the implementation. And that is something that we will guard very closely to respect that. If a company feels that eventually we are taking a decision that is violating this non-discrimination principle or any other legal rule, as it goes with Commission decisions, they can be appealed before the EU courts in Luxembourg eventually.
And we're, I guess, talking about years before we come to a final decision, right? It just goes through the normal process of the Luxembourg courts, General Court, ECJ. How would it work? Just
in the years in courts, I mean, that I cannot talk about, but the procedure within the DG, I think, and that I want to respond partially to what Mary just mentioned, and that is that parallelism with EUMR, the EU merger regulation. And we have seen indeed in the cases that were brought to our attention that there is this parallelism. And the timelines of the FSR are foreseeing that if parties notify under the FSR and the EUMR in parallel, that also it will be processed in parallel. The outcomes can be different, obviously, but that is because the objectives of the two instruments are different.
This adds surely just another level of complexity in what you're describing.
For the undertakings, you mean? Well, I think that the undertakings business has already from the very beginning been supportive to this legislative proposal. And I think that the objective of creating a level playing field, businesses were in favor of that because they were noticing that indeed there was this unjust situation in which they found themselves in competition with another company being funded by a non-EU country. So I think that the companies accept that there is some administration to go with this additional instrument. We can come later on whether that is proportional or not. But so that is accepted. I think we will also need to explain, if we come to different outcomes on EUMR and FSR, why that is the case. So I would not call it necessarily a level of complexity, but it is more a matter of communicating rightly about what is the objective of the FSR and why have we come to the decision that we will eventually come to.
Interesting. So Yves-Emmanuel, can you talk about a little bit of just your insights about the process of appeal or anything that you're picking up as you were discussing this legislation?
Of course, I think one of the elements that was mentioned by Eddy just now is the timing element, so how long the procedures are going to take. And this is, of course, a matter of concern for the Council and for Member States. So basically, I think for merger, as Eddy said, merger control, it's clear that we need to have the procedures run parallel, so for the same timing as we have in merger controls. Actually, the procedures are relatively short in terms of timing, as we know. So I think that's the best way to go, because it's very clear that the same kind of deals will run through both procedures when, of course, they meet the thresholds of both procedures. In terms of merger control, in terms of public procurement control, this is somewhere where the Council and the Parliament were in agreement, and we shortened the delay quite a lot for the Commission in order to be sure that actually it will lead to a timely outcome in terms of running the bidding processes. Also, what I can say is that we wrote the regulation in a very non-discriminatory way. So in terms of the text and the spirit of the text, it's very clear that non-discrimination runs everywhere. And in terms of the notification obligations, for example, we have very clear thresholds. So there is no discretion for the Commission in judging the thresholds, if you want. These are already set in the regulation. They will define what companies need to what kind of deals need to be notified to the Commission. There is, of course, the possibility for the Commission to force a notification in some cases, but we think this should probably be quite limited in the end. Also, I must say, with regard to the ex officio, as Eddy said, of course, the Commission will be under the control of the court. So we have all the guarantees that we normally have in these kind of procedures for companies if they feel to be targeted unfairly. But of course, the FSR implementation is a very important deal for member states. We're going to follow this implementation very closely. I think it was an interesting sign that the negotiation in the Council and Parliament and between the Council and Parliament were quite speedy, because it shows that there was a huge consensus, and this was shared, as Eddy said, by companies, that there is a void that needs to be filled in terms of legal obligations of these kind of foreign subsidies. So building on this consensus, of course, the implementation will be key, and it will need to remain as proportionate and as non-discriminatory as we aimed when we were designing this text.
Interesting. Merit, do you foresee a scenario, though, in how we're talking about this regulation, where we might see just a plethora of notifications and not enough people to deal with them?
On the people, I can't comment. I trust
know
that
somebody here who might.
Eddy might be able to comment on the people. I can tell you what, in terms of deals, I see coming up just by looking at the technical jurisdictional thresholds that are built into the regulation. There are two types of thresholds. One is the turnover thresholds, which is quite high, admittedly. We're talking about 500 million EU turnover, which is double the 250 million of the EU merger regulation. So I'm with Yves-Emmanuel and Eddy on that one. Like, it's only going to be the big ticket M&A in the EU that actually falls under that. That I think is good. The second threshold is the financial contributions threshold, and we're coming back to the broad definition of financial contributions. And that one is a bit tricky because it's 50 million over 3 years by both the target and the acquirer. So these are a lot of caveats, and I think what we'll see in reality is that many businesses are just going to tick the box on the 50 million because they're unsure whether they actually are above or below, and then you aggregate for 3 years and then you add the target to it, for which you, if you're an acquirer, might not even have the information readily available. So to be on the safe side and not fall into like a gun jumping territory, you would rather then err on the side of caution and submit a notification. So bottom line, I think for every deal where the EU turnover threshold of 500 million is met, we're likely going to see an FSR notification. It's then on the Commission again to assess which ones of those are really problematic from an FSR perspective in terms of distortions of competition in the EU stemming from foreign subsidies, and which ones are just more of the technical filings that come from the private equity outfits of this world or the pension funds, which do business with one fundamental aim, and that is to make profits for their shareholders, and all of that is conducted on market terms. So I'm hopeful that for those, we will have a smooth ride.
So, Eddy, on the people question, and just to anticipate, as I was preparing for this discussion today, how many people are there to be dealing with this regulation from October the 12th?
They are already there, and we are not waiting for the 12th of October, Javier. And I'm not on my own. That's already good news. Within the DG, you have a team that is dedicated 100% on FSR, only doing that. In addition, in the DG, we have had some secondment of colleagues from merger and state aid, because that is where we need the expertise, to the FSR team. We have the different merger and state aid units with their sectorial expertise that we can also go to if we have a specific question. We have also, shortly, we will have 2 national experts joining us, and maybe a few others later. So the team is definitely big enough in order to handle the notifications that are coming our way.
So we're talking dozens, hundreds? What's the scope?
Well, not hundreds, definitely not. I know that in the financial statement to the legislative proposal, we have asked for more than 100, and I think that is a number that we have in. I think when putting it forward in the proposal, we were strongly believing, and still today, that we could accommodate that. That's not the number that we got. I think our main objective for the moment is to make sure, as Merit said, that those deals that are brought to our attention, that they are not held up by the very fact that we would not be able to handle it. And that I can assure you, whatever number of notifications coming in, we will be handling them properly and efficiently. What matters though, and that is true also for the EUMR and also for the FSR, is that you come and talk to us as soon as possible. So these pre-notification discussions are important in order to exactly, as Merit says, see which are the financial contributions that need to be reported. If you have questions on the jurisdictional threshold being met or not, that we can do in a pre-notification context. And I'm happy to see that indeed companies are coming to talk to us in pre-notification. We have for the moment 17 cases of pre-notification discussions. And that's good. When they will notify eventually, I mean, that is for the parties to determine. But we are in those discussions, and I notice that the awareness is being raised, particularly in Brussels, I need to say. Maybe we need to do some further activities broader. But the awareness is there, and I see willingness on the side of the parties to engage with us in the pre-notification discussions.
And you talk about further activities maybe to encourage others. What sort of things are you thinking about to promote compliance from companies?
Yeah, well, I'll come to awareness raising in a second, and because that is very important. There is, you can get to compliance the hard way, and Merit alluded to that. And you have the fines and the periodic penalty payments. If you're not replying to a request for information, if you don't submit to an inspection, then, or indeed if you are gun jumping, then there is a possibility for the Commission to impose fines. Also important, and that is new for the competition world, not for the trade colleagues, is that we can adopt a decision on the basis of the facts available. So say, I'm sending you a request for information. You may think, I'll pay the fine if I don't reply. There is another downside to not cooperating with us, and that is that we can take a decision on the basis of the facts available. And trade colleagues are telling us that that is usually to the detriment of the company that refused to cooperate. So 2 more hard law incentives to comply. But it is also important that we front load that compliance, that we create the right circumstances for companies to comply with the FSR. And awareness raising is part of the efforts that we need to do there in order to go to the companies and their consultants to explain and over again what the FSR is about. And we are available for that. I hope that also people in the audience will recognize the efforts that we have been doing in that respect. Awareness raising is important. Secondly, it is also important that we have been listening to business in order to come to a text that is acceptable. Compliance is higher when there is an acceptance of the text. Acceptance in the context of FSR means particularly administrative burden. No red tape. I think companies, as I just said, have accepted that there is a good objective, there is some administration that goes with it, but there shouldn't be disproportional red tape. And I think that has been achieved, both by the co-legislators in setting the high threshold, but also subsequently in the implementing regulation, where we had a very good back and forth with industry during the public consultation on the implementing regulation. We have come to an implementing regulation that is no longer disproportionately asking for financial contributions that would not matter, as Merit is referring to. So making sure that the rules feel acceptable, doing an awareness raising, that matters in order to ensure compliance. Finally, if I may, finally there is the issue of being transparent on how we are going to implement the regulation. The co-legislator asked us to come with guidance, and we are indeed accepting to provide that guidance after having gained some experience in the implementation of the FSR. But because we got a number of recurrent questions, we have put on our website already Q&As of the frequently asked questions. And I hear that is appreciated, that we give transparency on the implementation through the Q&As. So hard rules, but also awareness raising and transparency via our Q&As and eventually through guidance.
So carrot and stick, to coin a phrase.
Yeah.
And I'm mindful of time, so we need to go a little bit faster. But Yves-Emmanuel, it sounds like the Commission is doing a lot, but I want to hear from member states. What are you going to do to get companies to comply?
Yeah, it's true, and we agreed from the start in the Council that this regulation is going to be implemented centrally by the Commission. So this is a single market instrument, so the role of the Commission will be paramount. But Member States certainly will have also a role in the implementation. This is, for example, the case in terms of public procurement. Procurement is a very public institution thing. Public procurement authorities are going to be very essential in transmitting the information to the Commission, discussing with the Commission when and where they think that maybe there are distorting foreign subsidies behind some kind of candidates. So clearly, they will have a very macroeconomic role in the functioning of this regulation. And more broadly, I think, but we can go back to that also, in terms of compliance, it's clear member states have already started to run awareness campaigns towards the companies. Again, let's be clear, this is a regulation that is going to address mainly very large undertakings. So it's their responsibility to be ready on day one, and every feedback we get is that now the companies are ready, they have understood of how this regulation is going to work, and they're ready to implement it, despite the fact that there are some technical changes, but these are things that we knew already in the 2000s when the EU merger regulation was implemented. As Merit said, this is basically the same questions we asked at the time. This is the fact that we have administrative burden and some kind of smoothing to be done at start is not sufficient reason not to act. So yes, there are some efforts need to be done in order to implement this regulation, but we are almost there.
So a country like France, how would you, in practice, help a company comply?
Well, of course, I guess in general, it will be mainly about the relationship between the company and the Commission. But certainly, we can give an advisory role. We can have an advisory role towards companies if they come to us, if they have questions. There is now a single contact point for the implementation of the FSR in every member state. So companies can also go to that to have some explanations. But of course, again, as I said, the implementation, this is a centrally led and run instrument. So the Commission will be enforcing these instruments. So this is the main actor, I would say. But of course, member states will be very vigilant in trying to be sure that this instrument is going to be run in full course.
Excellent. And so, Merit, as you working with companies, how do you see this relationship between first the regulator, but then also the country where a company sits or where they're doing business? What opportunities do you see for engagement?
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting question if you look at it from a state or a country perspective. There's obviously the 27 member states that will do everything they can to make their companies or businesses comply and help them, exactly as Yves-Emmanuel just explained. The interesting part, I think, is what do the rest of the world countries do and how do they position themselves? And that, I think, we will have to see. It's a little bit up in the air whether there will be some sort of crystallization of the good guys under the regulation that always comply, that provide information to the Commission, or the bad guys that are more difficult and not responding to information requests. Like we heard, Eddy, there is no blacklist and no set kind of list of countries that is primarily in scope of the FSR. I hope that that's going to be the case, because I really think that by looking at this enforcement regime, the only way you can do it in a proportionate and, I think, measured way is on a case-by-case basis. Every deal is different. Every financing structure is different. Every company is different in terms of ownership structure. So you can only really approach this without having any particular countries or geographies in mind, but by looking at what is actually in scope and what is the transaction that is assessed. And to do that in a proportionate and reasonable way, as I said, which boils down again to what information is required and how are you then going to find out whether an individual financial contribution is actually likely to do something which Eddy described as confer a benefit, an advantage, and then also impact competition. That's a case-by-case assessment.
Excellent. Thank you so much so far for all your contributions. So now over to you. Remember, if you'd like to ask a question, either scan the QR code that pops up on your screen regularly or use the hashtag Let's Talk Competition on the Slido website. Just type your question and press ask. So let's take our first question from Slido in the roughly 15 minutes that we have left. And thank you so much for people joining us and spending an hour of your day listen to the secrets that we're about to reveal. So Eddy, I think I want to start with this question. What's a potential test case and what it could look like? And you feel free to tell us what your first test case is going to be.
For that one, you will still need to wait a bit, Javier. And I think it's important to underline what Merit just mentioned. We need to look at every case in its own merits. I don't think that we need to come out with symbolic cases. What matters is that we are using the instrument in order to prevent distortions caused by foreign subsidies. Whichever sector that may be, whichever third country subsidizing. So to now say this is the ideal case, no, I think that we will come out once we presume having sufficient suspicion of a distorted foreign subsidy. That is when you will see our first case coming out.
Let's ignore the country question or the sector question. So let's talk about the smoking gun. So you're presented a case. What is it that will raise red flags for you to really take a case on the merits, as you said?
I think the co-legislator helped us in finding the red flags, namely by identifying which are the most distorted foreign subsidies. It's a type of subsidies that within the EU are not accepted. And so they are listed in the FSR. For the nitwits, it's Article 5. And that already gives an indication. But also beyond that, beyond Article 5, I mean, we're not going to limit ourselves to going after Article 5 subsidies. But if you go beyond Article 5, big subsidization to a company that may be dominant or in a sector where there is already an overproduction, that may be indications where we are going to to go for a first case.
What does big look like in terms of how would you quantify it?
That is a relative concept, because it depends, of course, on how the market is organized. I think a certain figure could be big in one sector and could mean nothing in another. So,
I'm interested to hear from the rest of the panel as well. What do you think in terms of maybe industries or sectors or the configuration? I know we have a list and we have Article 5, but what's your thinking on the ground when you think about the implementation of this regulation?
I think to some extent that this is also going back to what Merit said with regard to the very wide definition of foreign contribution. We don't know. And very honestly, we don't know, because we have some evidence, some anecdotal evidence, market information coming from companies. But this is why, as co-legislators, we built on a very wide definition of financial contribution, is that we don't know exactly what is the most distortive, as in kind of subsidies, in kind of sectors that could be covered. So this is why we prevented from waiving off some particular sectors from the application of this regulation. This is a very wide applying regulation covering all the sectors, because of this very idea that we don't know exactly what kind of foreign subsidies are creating the most distortions in the single market. We have some evidence, some clear cases where it's very likely that there have been very strong distortions from foreign subsidies, but it's only anecdotal. So with this regulation, we are going to get excellent information about what is really problematic. And probably over the life of this instrument, we are going to be able to refine the scope and to refine how it's supposed to work in order to avoid all the unnecessary administrative burden that comes right now with it, because we simply don't know what is necessary or unnecessary administrative burden. This is something I hope maybe co-legislators will have to come back to in a few years.
Okay, you got it. You heard it first. FSR2 coming your way. Merit, can you on the ground?
Yeah.
Your clients are multinationals. They're thinking about these things. What, in terms of areas, industries, types of companies, countries? Just give us a little bit of a sense of what do you think a test case or a case, a prominent case, could look like.
2 points on that, Javier. I think first, difficult to say in terms of sectors or companies. What I would not necessarily agree with is the Article 5, likely distortive foreign subsidies. Yes, they are in the regulation, but does that mean that every Article 5 case is a big test case and causes a lot of issues? I don't necessarily think so. You can have a likely distortive foreign subsidy within the meaning of Article 5. Somewhere in your group of company, if you're a big conglomerate multinational, you might have an ailing company somewhere that has received financial contributions, or you might have an unlimited state guarantee, but it does not necessarily mean that your case and scope and your transactional scope also is a problematic case within the meaning of the FSR. So I'd be careful on this Article 5 thing, that this is all, where the music plays and the rest is irrelevant. And the other point is the test cases for me are also the ones which are the technical filings. Like the not so problematic ones, but the ones that they get that you get on the desk where the turnover threshold is met, but where clear signs are that there's no subsidization going on. I think that's also going to be then a test for the Commission to show that they can deal with them quickly and not look at these more than required to do the case-by-case assessment.
Interesting. Very good. So, second question. Our company has an upcoming case in the pipeline, but we're still unsure if we have collected the relevant information that the Commission require. Will the same procedure as under EUMR reviews apply, where companies can go into pre-notification with the Commission before having to notify? I guess that's a question for you, Eddy.
And in short, the answer is yes, of course. You're very welcome. That's typically the kind of questions that we are happy to discuss with you in a pre-notification context.
Perfect. I guess let's move now to some on the screen here from Philippines. Will you update the DG Comp Q&A section? I guess it's another question for you, Eddy.
Well, I just underlined that we find the Q&A awaiting guidance that will come later down the road once we have sufficient enforcement experience. In the meantime, the Q&A is giving the transparency on the implementation. So yes, it is our intention to keep the Q&A updated with recurrent questions that we are getting from stakeholders.
In terms of timeline as to when we should expect a new update or how frequently you will do that?
Well, that depends obviously on how regularly we are getting questions, and we see...
And how regularly are you getting questions from people?
Less than in the beginning. I mean, the summer was busy with lots of questions coming in, and I think that by also being present at conferences, events like today's one, clarification is being given. So I think the questions are becoming more and more case specific. And for those, we would recommend, rather than going for a Q&A, rather than to go for a pre-notification contact.
Interesting. Tono from MLEX, thanks for your question. Companies have already engaged in pre-notification talks over the last months. What has been the general tone of these talks, and have waivers proven to be useful? I guess let's talk to Merit first, because you, I'm sure, have had conversations already.
The tone is very positive. No, I mean, let's
you really want the deal through, right?
I think it's pre-notification, like in merger control cases. Everything is at the early stages, so there is obviously a little bit more back and forth on why is certain information necessary. Do we really have to do that? Can we come and explain? But I've experienced that if you do engage with the case team and seek confirmation on individual points, you have an open door there. The topic of waivers, I think, is an interesting one, just because it's raised in the question, because a lot of hope was actually put on these waivers, that, you know, you can actually then go in and say, look, half of the information I'm requesting a waiver because it's irrelevant. I don't think that that's going to work, but that's what businesses ideally want. So I think there the bets are out really on how the waiver thing is going to work in practice.
Yves-Emmanuel, do you want to have a go before we put it to Eddy?
In general terms, it's clear that we are going to be very scrutinizing these kind of questions in the next few months, also for the sake of our companies, to be sure that in terms of the implementation, proportionality is really paramount. And this is what the Commission, I think, has been doing in the pre-notification discussions. So we will be very vigilant to be sure that it remains the case, but we have no doubt, actually.
Eddy?
I'm happy to confirm that the tone has indeed been positive and constructive. I think that companies and their advisors are indeed engaging in the conversation that we are having. What is interesting is that we note that in the 17 pre-notification cases that we got so far, all of them are parallel to pre-notification talks under the EUMR. That's how we more or less expected it to be. So again, their parties are advised to keep that parallelism. Discussions on waivers, we did not have yet, but it is true, as Merit says, and that just not feeling like providing information will not lead to a waiver. But if you can indeed convince us that you cannot reasonably get to the information, then that is where a waiver would be possible.
Excellent. Okay, let's go back to our questions. Why is there no public database created like the one for EU merger control? I guess that's one for you again.
A database on cases. Well,
I guess that's what the person asking.
Yeah, well, the first notification still needs to come in. And I think once, the FSR is very clear that once we go into a second phase, then we will, I'm happy to put that on a database. It will even be in the official journal. So there is, the second phase cases will be made public.
Okay. Now, this is a question, I guess, also for Eddy, but feel free for other people to also take part. What is the substantive test in the context of concentrations? Can there be an issue outside a structured bidding process?
The answer there is yes, and it can be other situations in which we can indeed prove that a foreign subsidy has created a benefit for the beneficiary, and that through that benefit you come into a situation where the competition is negatively affected. That can be a direct facilitation, that is one of the Article 5s, and so you got the money in order to do the concentration, the acquisition. But that is, I'm not sure how many of those cases we will see, but it can also be indirectly. And that because of the subsidization in the undertaking, that the competitive process is distorted.
So, Merit, clearly quite a lot of ground for different questions. I guess, how are you navigating this?
Yeah, I think that's actually, for me, that sits at the heart of which cases are difficult and which are not, which is like, what's the legal test under the regulation? And there we always struggled because by the pure reading of the text, you can either conclude that we're talking about, as what Eddy described, as a potential distortion to an M&A bidding procedure or a structured bidding process for the acquisition of a certain target. On the other hand, you can also look at competition in the market, in the relevant markets in which the target actually operates. And I think, if I think I read the text correct, like if you want to be really off the hook, you need to look at both of these angles and ensure that you're not only looking at your bidding procedure to ensure that you're not using state money to buy an EU target, but that likewise you ensure that also from the markets concerned under the transaction, you are in a non-subsidy world. So I think more clarification on that front of what's actually going to be assessed on the substantive level is for sure something that people would be tremendously helpful and thankful about.
And on the subject of clarification, we have a question that says, can you please clarify whether for a participation in a tender, the company needs to also report the subsidies received by sister companies in the group? I guess.
In the context of a concentration, we have used the concept of undertaking, which is very familiar to everybody dealing with competition law on the enforcement side and also on the side of law firms. And so the concept of undertaking indeed also encompasses the sister companies.
Mm-hmm. There's a question actually about the relationship between WTO law and this regulation, which I thought we addressed at the beginning, but maybe Yves-Emmanuel, if you want to just reinforce the points that Eddy made at the beginning, I think that would be good.
Yeah, of course. So basically, this regulation is a complement to WTO law. You can see it like that. It stops where WTO law begins. So it will not go beyond that in any way. That's very clear from what was Article 40 in the draft regulation. Basically, so there is a clear articulation between instruments at EU levels. As Eddy said before, you have the anti-subsidy instruments from a trade defense side, and on the side of the single market, you have this new instrument, which basically, as a single market instrument, has no direct relationship with the WTO law, apart from the fact that it will stop where WTO law begins.
We're almost out of time, but I think I'll take this very quick question. What about third country government classified information? Should they be provided to the European Union under the FSR? Eddy?
I think we need to distinguish between confidential and classified information. I think the confidential information, yes, because of course our procedures will be confidential in the sense that we will maintain the confidentiality of business secrets and other confidential information. I do know that in certain sectors there may be classified information where even in the company that is under investigation, not everybody has access to, because it's top secret information. What we may try to do in that case is that we contact ourselves, the third country, in order to get the pieces of the information that we consider relevant in order to conduct our case. And there is always also the possibility of a waiver. If nobody really can get to that information reasonably, then there may be a waiver for that. But we will first try other means if we consider that information to be relevant for the case that we are investigating.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today on this discussion on the FSR. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope you did too. More episodes are in the making, and we'll let you know about them very soon. So please keep an eye on DG Comp's website and follow DG Comp on X, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and you can share the episode and watch it again if you go to the DG Competition YouTube channel. And thank you so much to my panelists today, and have a good afternoon.